Welcome to Professor Burkett's lesson on footnote citation in Chicago style according to Turabian, 8th edition. This is an introductory lesson on documenting sources with note style or footnote style citation. Who writes with Chicago style? Well, writers in the humanities, biblical studies, literary studies, history, music, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology make use of note style citation outlined in the Manual for Writers, chapters 16 through 17. As anytime you see something with a footnote or endnote, that's an example of the Chicago style, note style citation. A preliminary question is, why cite sources? Well, research writers have an ethical responsibility to authors, readers, and themselves. Your first duty as a researcher is to get the facts right. Your second duty is to tell readers where the facts came from. To that end, you must cite the sources of the facts, ideas, or words that you use in your paper, according to a Manual for Writers. Regarding duty to authors, give credit where credit is due, rather than trying to appropriate that for oneself and make people think that you're the originator of words and ideas when in fact you're not. Duty to readers. Assure readers about the accuracy of facts and the quality of your work, which is a matter of ethos and showing your credibility as a researcher and writer. Second, show readers the research paths and theoretical traditions that inform your work. Also, you have a duty to yourself to avoid charges of a breach of trust, regarding the ethics of scholarship, and to record for yourself your trail of sources so you can find it in the future. A safe principle is to follow your conscience. If your conscience is bothering you, well then, follow this safe rule. When in doubt, cite it. When should one cite sources? A research or analysis paper is a collaboration between a writer's voice and the voices of other writers as represented in sources. As such, a writer needs to cite borrowed words and ideas. Well, writers borrow or refer to sources and voices by quoting, summarizing, paraphrasing, or listing a fact or statistics as appropriate, each introduced by a signal phrase and followed by a citation. Direct quotation should be enclosed in quotation marks followed by a citation. Summaries condense information, giving the sense of a source followed by a citation. Paraphrases rephrase information and meaning in one's own words, followed by a citation. Facts and statistics are shared in context and need to be followed by a source citation. There's one exception. Writers need not cite what target readers consider to be common knowledge, information that is familiar to your target readers in the particular discourse community, and that is easily found in general reference works. Writers in the humanities make use of two citation styles. Again, Chicago style in the humanities involves a system of footnote, or sometimes endnote, citations for sources referenced by page numbers, and B, a system of classical citation in parentheses for sacred, classical, and older literary sources referenced by division numbers, such as chapter and verse. And here are some examples. A footnote citation for sources referenced by page numbers looks like this: the author's name, the title of the work, facts of publication, followed by the page number in a period. Classical citation for sacred, classical, and older literary sources referenced by number division, such as Genesis 1:28. And the first time I reference the Bible, I include in brackets the standard abbreviation for that translation or version. Also, I'm required to have a bibliography entry for sources placed in the list of works cited at the end of my paper. And then you have the author's last name, first name, the title of the work, and the facts of publication. Now, the footnote citation is ordered by footnote number, and the bibliography entries are ordered differently, alphabetically by the author's last name. When writers refer to sources, they make 3 or 4 important moves depending on the type of source. a signal phrase, an in-text citation, a footnote at the bottom of the page, and a bibliography entry. First, the source is introduced by a signal phrase that names the author and separates the writer's words clearly from the author's words. Second, the material being cited is followed by either A, a superscripted note number, or B, a classical citation in parentheses, both placed at the end of the sentence. Third, the in-text note number has a corresponding numbered footnote at the bottom of the page that provides information about the source and relevant page numbers. And fourth, a list of works cited at the end of the paper gives complete publication information about the sources. A manual for writers describes note-style citation, which is also called note bibliography style citation and sometimes just bibliography citation. In note-style citations, you signal that you have used a source by writing a signal phrase and by placing a superscript number at the end of the sentence in which you refer to it, as the following example, and you can see the footnote number at the end of the sentence. You then cite the source of that quotation in a corresponding numbered note that provides information about the source, author, title, facts of publication, plus relevant page numbers. Notes are printed at the bottom of the page, called footnotes. You can see the example. If you cite the same text again, you can shorten subsequent notes in a shortened note. And you can see the example footnoted number 5. You also list sources at the end of your paper in a bibliography or list of works cited. Each bibliography entry includes the same information contained in a full footnote, but in a slightly different form, where the author's last name comes first and periods separate the different items in the footnote. Well, signal phrases. One should not introduce sources with the word says, but with some other word that helps interpret the tone of the text or the author's intention. So writers introduce authors with signal phrases, usually placed before the quotation and usually in the literary present tense, both to introduce and to separate an author's words and ideas from one's own words and ideas. For instance, the French existentialist writer Albert Camus suggests that the world of myth is a world of no more questions, only eternal answers and commentaries. And at the bottom of the screen you will see verbs and signal phrases. And again, it's best to use these verbs and avoid the word says or said, and write in the literary present tense when referring to literature or text or what happens in those texts. Placing note numbers. Writers place a superscript number at the end of the sentence that references the source. Word processors automatically insert numbered footnotes for you. You don't have to do that manually. And this is the basic procedure. Click Insert Footnote from the References tab on the main ribbon menu of your word processor. The word processor adds a superscript note number at the location of the cursor and also adds a corresponding footnote number at the bottom of the page, separated from the main text by a short line. Then, when filling in the footnote with the source's information, you should ensure that the footnote has the same typeface as your text, but in a smaller 10-point size font. And at the bottom of the page you can see some examples, including a print source and also a source from the internet, where you simply add accessed date, a comma, and then the URL, or Uniform Resource Locator, followed by a period. Well, what is in a note citation for both the citation of a book and the citation of an article? Well, they're similar, but there's some distinct differences, and I'll just let you pause if you like and take a look at the comparison and contrast of these two common forms of citation, and the examples at the bottom. Well, what is in a bibliography entry for a book and a journal article, for instance? Well, again, the information is similar, but there are some distinct differences, and you can see how that is illustrated at the bottom of the page, and you can pause this and take a look at a longer look if you like. Well, basic patterns. Basic pattern of a note style citation and basic pattern of a bibliography entry. And there are some similarities and differences. For instance, in a footnote, you have the author's first name and last name, but in the bibliography entry, you have the author's last name and then the first name. The name's inverted because the bibliography is organized alphabetically. Well, again, I'll let you pause this if you like and take a look at the differences and the similarities. Well, here are some examples of note bibliography style. First, you have on top the example footnotes, and on the bottom the corresponding bibliography entries which would go in the list of works cited. Well, there's something called complex notes. Rhetorically, notes improve the reader's experience by avoiding lengthy references that clutter the text, by placing note numbers at the end of the clause or sentence, and by subordinating reference details to the bottom of the page. So, when making multiple references and citing multiple sources, the writer should not put a note after each quoted word or referenced phrase, but place the note at the end of the sentence and write up a complex footnote. Manual for Writers puts it this way: if you cite several sources to make a single point, group them into a single note to avoid cluttering your text with reference numbers. List the citations in the same order in which the references appear in the text and separate the citations with semicolons. So at the bottom of the page is an example of that. There's Richard Leo Enos, Greek rhetoric before Aristotle, and then after that citation is a semicolon, and it moves on to Richard Graff, reading and the written style in Aristotle's rhetoric. So here we have a complex footnote that includes two sources separated by a semicolon. Well, there's also substantive notes, which provide additional explanatory information in a footnote. Well, writers make use of source notes, substantive notes, and citation comments together. Well, substantive notes provide information that is deemed not important enough for placing in the main text, such as definitions of technical terms or explanations about sources, but writers may offer details important for some readers. And Turabian, Manual for Writers, puts it this way: if a note includes both a citation and a substantive comment, put the citation first with a period after it, followed by a comment in a separate sentence. They also add, be judicious in your use of substantive comments and notes. If a point is critical to your argument, include it in the main text. If it is peripheral, think carefully about whether it is important enough to mention in a note. So later in this presentation, I give some examples of what a substantive note will look like. Chicago style makes extensive use of short forms for notes. Writers give a complete citation the first time citing a work, and a shortened citation in all subsequent notes, including enough information for readers to find the full citation in the bibliography. Shortened notes can take three forms: the author-only notes, or better for the humanities, the author title notes, and also the Latin abbreviation IBID, which means the same as above. The basic pattern is on the left, and some examples are on the right. And again, in the humanities, writers generally prefer the author, a shortened title of the work, followed by the page number. Well, use IBID carefully. IBID means in the same place or same as above in Latin, and is used in a note when one refers to the same work as an immediately preceding note with no intervening notes on the same page. IBID takes the place of the author's name and as much information as is identical to the preceding footnote. IBID is not italicized or underlined. IBID is an abbreviation, and so it must end with a period. Now, pay attention to this. Do not use IBID to refer to prior footnotes that do not appear on the same page of your essay. So the first A footnote on an individual page of your essay should not be ibid, because then the reader would have to flip back to the prior page to see what ibid refers to. Let's look at some examples. The first footnote citation to a work would look like example number 1, where you have Max Plowman and the title, publication information, and page number. Then, with no intervening notes, a second citation of the same page requires only ibid, as example number 2. Well, given an intervening reference, a third mention to Plowman's text requires a shortened citation, as in example 4. And in the humanities, it's preferred to have not just the author's name, but also a shortened title of the book. Well, the following citation, example number 5, refers to a different page of Plowman's text. Chicago style makes a distinction between traditional and new media and how one cites these sources. So for Chicago style, online sources fall into 2 categories by necessity and are cited slightly differently. First, there's traditional media, such as online versions of books and journals, which are just about the same as their print counterparts, and these are cited similarly to print sources, but also with the date accessing the source and the URL, or the shortened version of that, the DOI, in one's the browser address. For sources at commercial or academic databases such as EBSCO, Academic Research Premier, JSTOR, LexisNexis, ProQuest, and so forth, use the recommended direct URL that is given with the source. But if no suitably short and direct URL exists, however, you may substitute the name of the database for the URL. So many times the URL is not needed or used for these sources. Instead, one just lists the database name. Second, new media, such as personal and institutional websites, blogs, wikis, and so forth, are cited by giving as much information as possible about it, in addition to an access date and the URL, or internet address. Well, this next note is highly important. Writers select sources worthy of their time and their target reader's attention. So writers avoid biased commercial and advocacy websites recognized as .com, .org, .net, and prefer relevant educational .edu and governmental .gov websites. A common question is, how does one cite ebooks? Well, it's quite simple, actually. A writer should cite ebooks just like their print counterpart version, but the writer should also include information about the format consulted. For ebooks online, include both an access date and the recommended URL. For ebooks in a library or commercial database, include the name of the database, such as ProQuest eBrary. For ebooks in a dedicated format, specify the format, such as Kindle, Microsoft, Sony, Adobe PDF, ebook, and so forth. If an ebook does not have page numbers or stable pagination, what does one do? Well, one should substitute one or more of the following: the chapter or another numbered division, the name of the chapter or section, even subtitles, or ebook location numbers. Examples are illustrated throughout Chapter 17, Section 1 of A Manual for Writers. Well, what should one do about anonymous sources? What if a source is anonymous? Well, then ask 2 questions. Is the source reputable enough for my target readers? Is the source purposeful enough for my purposes? If yes, then 4 options exist for how to cite an anonymous source. First, you name the editor or translator in place of the author, and here's an example. Second, list the organization as the corporate author, and an example, American Allergy Association. Third, include the speculated name in brackets, and this is quite common in the classics, for instance, Aristotle. And if it's highly speculative, one could add a question mark after the author's name in the bracket, because it's thought that Aristotle did not author Rhetoric to Alexander, referring to Alexander the Great, but somebody else in the Aristotelian tradition of the arts of rhetoric. Fourth, begin the note or entry with the title. That is, just leave out the author's name. For instance, Encyclopedia of the Carolinas, when that really old book doesn't specify an author. Well, how does one cite a book in a series, such as a commentary or a Bible commentary? Well, when referring to a book volume that is part of a series, such as a Bible commentary series, writers usually include information about the series to help readers locate and judge the credibility of the source. One places the series information after the volume's title and before the facts of publication, writing the series title with headline-style capitalization but without italics. One usually omits the name of the series editor and the volume number, if any, but one may include this information. At the bottom of the page is two examples, such as Andreas J. Kostenberger, John is the volume he wrote, comma, and it's part of the Baker Exegetical Commentary on the New Testament, followed by the publication information in parentheses and the page number. And when listing the series title, one takes out the article, whether it is the word the or the letter A. Well, how does one cite study notes, such as notes on the bottom of the page or in the margin of primary sources like the Bible and many classical and literary sources? Well, writers cite study notes in the same way as regular footnotes, but just after the page number, one adds the designation in, or plural in, if referring to multiple notes, plus the note number. When referencing a study Bible's notes, the citation should list the editors in the author position, the title of the work, publication facts, page number, and note number, if any is given. And again, the editor should be in the name of the author position because the editors are responsible if they did not directly write the notes that you might be citing. And at the bottom of the page are some examples. And you can see on the right-hand side of each example is the page number with the in, and then the 1:27 referring to note 51 for Genesis 1:27 on the image of God in the ESV Study Bible. Okay. Now in the second example, I've included two notes after the page 330 in notes 5 through 6, and afterwards I include a substantive note or an explanatory note. Well, how does one cite reference works? Well, most reference works, dictionaries, encyclopedias, and lexicons, are cited in footnotes in a slightly different form, in fact, in a very easy form. So it is optional whether to include reference works in the list of works cited, but as in the examples below, writers do include a bibliography entry when the source is a specialized source, it's cited often in your paper, or it's critical to your evidence or argument. Manual for Writers puts it this way: for a work arranged by key terms, such as a dictionary or encyclopedia, cite the item, not the volume or page number, preceded by SV, which is Latin. It stands for under the word, or plural SVV, under the words. And at the bottom of the page are some examples from the Encyclopedia of Rhetoric and Composition, under the word paradigm shift, and so forth. So for these reference works, page numbers are not really helpful, and what is helpful is to give the name of the item that you happen to be discussing in your work. As a principle, writers avoid using quoted in when they find a useful quotation in another secondary source. Instead, they look up the original source, which might involve a simple search with a search engine. Turabian puts it this way: responsible researchers avoid repeating quotations that they have not actually seen in the original. If one source includes a useful quotation from another source, readers expect you to obtain the original to verify not only that the quotation is accurate, but also that it fairly represents what the original meant. If the original source is unavailable, however, cite it as quoted in the secondary source in your note. So that last sentence is a qualification, but the general principle is the rallying cry of the Renaissance and the Reformation: back to the sources, to the original source. And that's what good researchers do. At the bottom of the page, I have an example from Charles Darwin, a very early third edition of his Origin of Species from 1861, which is no longer available, but is quoted in a much later edition of the same work. And I also add a substantive note after the footnote. So in this early edition of his Origin, Darwin responds to the charge of personifying nature, replying, "It is hard to avoid personifying the word nature," which is the quotation I was looking for on page 165. But again, it's always best to go back to the original source. Well, formatting the list of works cited. Well, in the Turabian manual, chapters 16 and 18 outline and illustrate which sources need to be placed in a bibliography and the correct forms of bibliographic entries. The bibliography, or list of works cited, is created as the last page or pages of an essay. It is titled as Works Cited in bold type. It is single-spaced and has one blank line between entries. Entries are arranged alphabetically by authors, or sometimes editors, in place of the author's last name, or by the title of works for anonymous sources. Entries are formatted with hanging indentation. Word processors will format hanging paragraphs by means of special paragraphing options. Now, what's the difference between a list of works cited and a bibliography? Well, list of works cited is a much more narrow designation, and you include only those works that you have referenced in your paper. A bibliography might include works that you have referenced and those that you have consulted. Well, here is a sample works cited page that comes at the end of an essay. You might look this over because it includes print versions of sources, some chapters, some articles, and online sources. Well, finally, is the following correct or incorrect? And this is a quiz. Well, John Piper summarizes the literary style of Scripture. The Bible is filled with every manner of literary device to add impact to the language: acrostics, alliteration, analogy, anthropomorphism, assonance, cadence, chiasm, consonants, dialogue, hyperbole, irony, metaphor, meter, onomatopoeia, paradox, parallelism, repetition, rhyme, satire, simile. They're all there and more. Then there's the note number and the footnote at the bottom, including a page number. I also have a colon before this block quotation, and I list the author's name, and I include a signal phrase. John Piper summarizes. Is there anything wrong with this citation? Well, if you answered no, that is correct, you're right. So this is an example of a good block style quotation. Finally, get the guidebook. Wise Writers Become Familiar with a Manual for Writers in its latest edition. For it gives writers the right to be right in front of evaluators about the many stylistic conventions of composition. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to seeing you in class. And at the bottom of this page you will find information about where to find the information that we have reviewed in this lesson on footnote style citation.